Most people think database design starts with tables, but it doesn't. It starts with messy real-world ideas, like students, email, or course. And here's where beginners go wrong. They can't tell what should be a table, what should be a column, or what should be ignored entirely. In this video, I'll show you how to turn vague ideas into clean and structured database tables so that your design doesn't break later. We'll cover two topics, starting with subjects and characteristics, then to entities and attributes. Let's get started. The database design process starts with interviewing relevant people of the organization who's going to use the database, like the stakeholders, software developers, and technical staff. Beyond the interview, you are also going to gather sample data and study the old system if there is any. For example, think about you are designing the database for an online store named the Sci-Fi Collective that is specialized in selling only sci-fi stuff. You will need to design different interview questions to interview different groups of relevant people and record the interview as well. The recorded data allows you to conduct the necessary analyses that identifies key information, the subjects and characteristics. Why do we need to care about subjects and characteristics? Well, valid subjects will ultimately turn into tables in your database design, and valid characteristics will turn into different columns in the corresponding tables. For example, think about a conversation with a software developer from the Sci-Fi Collective, as is presented here. You asked this question: what are the main tasks or activities you perform that involve data storage or retrieval? And get this response from the one that you interviewed. If you analyze this response, you will be able to identify these subjects and characteristics, as is highlighted here on the screen. How is the analysis carried out? The analysis focuses on the nouns that can be used in sentences with a verb like has or owns, like this. If you parse this response, you will get two subjects, user and other, as is shown here, and four characteristics like account and payment methods associated with the user, and product information and total price associated with the order. This analysis step can be labor-intensive, but it doesn't necessarily involve a whole lot of critical thinking and decision-making, so you may ask a generative AI tool to give you a hand. With a request for ChatGPT like this: I'm doing database design, help me identify the subjects and their corresponding characteristics from the transcript of the interview, and then provide your transcript. The context, I'm doing database design, is kind of important. Without it, ChatGPT may or may not know what you are doing. And one important feature about generative AI tools is that they are terrible at asking clarifying questions, or say they don't ask any clarifying questions at all. Of course, you still need to evaluate the work from AI and make a lot of revisions and eventually make your final calls. If you do all the hard work required by this task for the Sci-Fi Collective, you will be able to identify this many subjects and their characteristics as are presented here on the screen. With such information, you're ready to start your design. The next topic is entities and attributes, and this is the step where you convert the identified subjects and characteristics to entities and attributes. Wait a second, did I mention that subjects will be turned into tables and characteristics will be turned into columns? Yes, I did. But I was not accurate enough. Between a subject and a table, there's a middleman called entity. An entity is a conceptual idea that you deal with during the design process, whereas a table is its corresponding implementation. The same thing can be said between an attribute and a column. So yes, a subject will ultimately be turned into a table, but it needs to be mapped to an entity first. Characteristics will be mapped to attributes before they are implemented as columns. Now, you are on the same page in terms of the terminology. Let's go over the key things in the mapping process. What's on the screen is an example of the mapping process. The user entity and its corresponding characteristics are what we identified for the database of the Sci-Fi Collective. And when you map them to entities/attributes, it will look like this on the right side of the arrow. There are two key things that I wanted to cover. The first is the entity representation. The second is the naming convention. First, how is the entity represented in the ultimate design diagram? By the end of the design and analysis step, you will deliver a design diagram. The representation is relatively straightforward. We use a rectangular box to represent an entity, and separate the entity name and its attribute names using a solid line. The attribute names will be listed one after another in different rows in this box. For example, the mapping between the subject user and its corresponding entity representation looks like this. The entity is represented as a rectangular box, as you can see here. The entity name, user, is separated from its attributes by a solid line. Okay, that's the first point. The second important thing about mapping subjects to entities is the naming convention. Of course, you are free to choose whatever suits you when it comes to name an entity and an attribute, but doing so arbitrarily will be bad for your design, let alone the implementation that comes afterward. Just think about the inconsistent usage of IDs and how much trouble that would introduce to the database admin, software developers who need to build on top of the database, and the analysts who need to extract data from the database. As a result, you are strongly recommended to pick one of the naming conventions and stick to it strictly. The most popular one is the snake case. Camel case and Pascal comes as the second and the third popular options. Whichever you choose, you need to be consistent and stick to it. For example, in this video, we will stick to the snake case from now on. The feature of the snake case is that words are all lowercase letters and separated using underscores. When the snake case is used, the subject of users will be mapped to the user entity as you see here for the Sci-Fi Collective database. Beyond the selection of the use of a consistent naming convention, you also want to pay attention to whether to use singular or plural in the naming. Singular names have their roots in object-oriented programming, and the plural names are more natural as table names. I'm not gonna get into the debate on which one is better. Whichever you choose, just be consistent. The inconsistency on something as small as this could easily drive a dozen of software developers crazy. In this video, we will stick to singular names for entities. Next, the upper limit of name length. Many database systems have limits on column name lengths. MariaDB, for example, limits column names to 64 characters. If you have such a column name, you should shorten it. Last, you should make sure that you are not using any of the reserved SQL keywords as names. Some of the common reserved keywords include table, any, data, or order. The list goes on and on. If you want a list of common reserved keywords in SQL, generative AI can help a lot. However, if you want a list of reserved keywords of a specific database system, like MySQL, you need to check its menu instead of relying on generative AI, because the information from generative AI tools may not be fully up to date. Now you know that the reserved keywords need to be avoided. And we happen to have such a subject named order. If we were to stick to this name, we will be using a common reserved SQL keyword. This will lead to many problems, such as syntax errors in SQL query execution and maintainability problems. As a result, we will rename this entity as purchase. So packing up all you need to know about how to map subjects to entities, the 5 subjects of the Sci-Fi Collective database will be turned into 5 entities as is presented here on the screen. In this video, we went through how to convert messy real-world ideas to entities and attributes. If you find this video helpful, consider giving it a thumb up, subscribe, and leave your questions in the comments. I would love to hear what's working for you and what needs to change. This video is based on the book Grokking Relational Database Design, which dives deeper into database design using real-world examples to explain the concepts. You can find the link to the book in the first comment.